Would you believe me if I told you that toad in the hole used to be made with pigeon? Today I'm cooking through its weird, wonderful history to find out how sausages won the Battle of the Batter. Toad in the hole is one of Britain's best loved comfort foods. Sausages baked in the Yorkshire pudding made from eggs, flour and milk. But here's the twist. It didn't start with sausages. The earliest versions involved pigeons, steak, kidneys, basically whatever meat was lurking in your kitchen. Because British food has sometimes been at war with joy, I'm coming fresh off the back of a pretty disastrous effort to cook some pig's trotters, and I just wanted to try something tasty. So I'm cooking 3 versions from 3 different centuries to see how it got from bird bath casserole to pub lunch of the gods, starting with the earliest recipe of them all. Hannah Glasse's 1747 recipe for pigeon in the hole is one of the earliest references to the in the hole recipe that we know now. Stop it. And you make it by taking a pigeon, preferably of the dead and pre-plucked variety, season it with beaten mace, pepper and salt. We're then told lay it in a dish before pouring a light batter all over it. And I'm going to cheat this a little bit by quickly browning off my pigeon in a pan with a little oil, just to pick up some colour. Then I'm putting some butter in the pan to get hot, before contenting myself with the batter. The recipe tells us to make a batter with a quart of milk, eggs and 4 or 5 spoons of flour. She doesn't mention how many eggs, but a good rule of thumb for me is using equal parts egg and flour. So if we need 4 or 5 spoonfuls of flour, a spoonful in 18th century English cooking usually referred to what we now call a tablespoon, though old tablespoons were larger than our ones today and were likely heaped. So I'm going for a balanced middle ground of 100 grams of plain flour, which means using about 2 eggs to match. Then onto the quart of milk. So her 18th century quart in modern measurements is a little under a litre, which I'm going to chicken out of at about half that, as we're well into crepe batter territory with half a litre still to go. We're then told to bake it and send it to the table. So into a hot buttered pan goes the batter, along with some butter which she hasn't specified, but this will need hot fat to rise. Place our pigeon into the batter nest and into the oven for about 20 minutes as the recipe signs off with, "It is a good dish." We're going to find out soon enough, but before we get to the next recipe in the following century, it's time for a historical intermission. So we've established that the earliest version of an in-the-hole recipe came from 1747, but it's had a long and meandering history. In the centuries after this recipe was published, the protein of choice included everything from pigeon to beef to mutton, and even offal like kidneys and liver. It started life in the 1700s as culinary trickery by budget-stretched cooks. You pad out a tiny bit of expensive meat with cheap, filling Yorkshire pudding. And by the time you get to 1861, Mrs. Beeton, who was the Victorian domestic goddess of the day, popularised it even further. But her version still sees steak and kidney as the main feature. And it wasn't until the 20th century that sausages really became the go-to meat, mainly because they were cheap and cheerful. And in fact, toad in the hole was often a way to stretch leftovers or hide the less glamorous cuts of meat in something tasty. But why the name? Thankfully, no actual toads have ever been harmed in the making of this dish. Dad joke time, but true. The term toad doesn't appear in any food-related slang of the time, so historians think it might just describe how the sausages poke out of the batter like little toad heads peeking out of a bog. Appetizing, I know. And what about the hole? Well, that's likely just the batter. When Yorkshire puddings are made well, they puff up around the meat, making a sort of edible crater. So you could argue that it is a toad in the hole, if you're feeling very poetic or maybe just very hungry and you don't care what you're eating. So after Hannah Glasse's pigeons in the hole, we then have to wait for about 80 years until we get our earliest recipe called toad in the hole. It comes from the amazing chef Alexis Soyer in 1850. Alexis Soyer was a flamboyant French chef who revolutionized kitchens, tried to feed the poor with soup kitchens, and fed troops in the Crimean War by inventing a portable stove that looked like a Victorian robot. Soyer starts by telling us to make a batter for the Yorkshire pudding, which by Soyer's reckoning meant putting 7 tablespoons of flour into a mixing bowl, along with 6 eggs, a pinch of salt, and a quarter of a pint of milk, before adding the remaining 3/4 of a pint of milk, stirring as you go. But interestingly for me, he then tells you to add 6 ounces of chopped beef suet. So we're definitely striving for some beefy depth of flavour here, but it's also gifted a slightly lumpy quality into what is again looking like a pretty liquidy pudding batter. Also excitingly, the previous century has brought about a key development in the Yorkshire pudding perfection: fat. Soyer tells us to butter a rather deep baking dish into which we pour the batter. So I'm buttering my pan and putting it into the oven to come up to a sizzle. Meanwhile, we're told to cut up 3 pounds of rump steak into 6 pieces. So I'm going to flash sear a 500 gram rump steak before slicing it and laying down the pieces into the batter. This looks promising, but I still feel like we're missing something, and that would be sausage. So it's on to our final recipe. By the 20th century, our toad holes were most commonly filled with sausage. I'm ashamed of myself. The earliest recipe I could find for a sausagey toad in the hole comes from Cassell's New Universal Cookery book in 1894, which actually suggests using sausage as a bit of an afterthought if you're out of beef, mutton, or even kidneys and liver are more preferable in the book. So into our pudding pan goes beef dripping, which we're told to let get hot in the oven. Then we're making one final batter by starting to mix 2 eggs with a ½ pound of flour. Now, although it's one of the earliest recipes to combine Yorkshire pudding and sausage, which deserves huge credit, they've clearly gone against the grain in other ways by using an egg to flour ratio that would be too solid for a pasta dough, never mind a batter. So I'm abandoning the whisk and digging out a wooden spoon and going to town, helped by adding a little bit of milk at a time, all until you realise you were also supposed to whisk in salt, pepper and baking powder, which does surprise me as it could make the pudding quite cakey, but I'm not sure how this is going to turn out anyway, and I'm just here to recreate. As I'm skipping the calls for mutton or beef, I'm taking a beautiful Cumberland sausage and letting it get a head start in the pan to pick up some colour, before pouring the batter into the tin and laying the sausage in the batter before returning to the oven. At which point we are greeted with the dawn of one of the greatest comfort meals ever created. All right, let's get tasting. So we have 3 different stages in the evolution of toad in the hole. I'm going to start with the one from 1747, Pigeons in the Hole. The pigeon is overcooked because I think most people would roast a pigeon for 10-12 minutes, which is not enough time to get a good Yorkshire pudding. We also have a Yorkshire pudding batter, which not sure if you can see, but it looks a little bit more like a Spanish omelette. But let's see if the flavour's good. 1747, first toad in the hole. The pigeon is delicious. The idea of the Yorkshire pudding is great. The difficulty is it's not a Yorkshire pudding. It's basically a 2 centimetre deep pancake. However, I was also cooking for one very small pan. This recipe would have been designed to feed a crowd. Okay, let's move on to the steak. Steak, Yorkshire pudding. Again, another Yorkshire pudding that looks suspiciously like an omelette. Try with some of my rump steak, which I've also never tried by cooking in the oven in this way. Overcooked steak and omelette. There is a sort of beefiness coming in from the suet, but you've got 6 eggs, a pint of milk, and just a couple of 100 grams of flour. It's just not enough. It's just way too liquidy. Not for me. This, however, is the dawn of one of the greatest meals ever. To the beginning of Toad in the Hole. The flavour is really tasty because it's used that beef dripping and probably set a bit of the standard for what we do today. This was the one that was more like a pasta dough when I was making it. Like some of the other ones, it's very thick. I guess the moral of the story is think hard about your measurements or you'll be eating a very thick pancake instead. I'm gonna go back for the pigeon, that was tasty. Bye.